I just watched a 90-minute interview with a geopolitics professor who predicted three things in 2024 that all came true. Trump winning the election, the US starting a war with Iran, and the US losing that war. All three. Exactly right. And in this same interview, he just made his next set of predictions. One of them has an 80 to 90% probability of happening. He called it basically a certainty. I'm going to break down everything he said in this video, because it's one of those interviews that genuinely changed how I see what's happening in the world right now. And by the end, I'll get to the one prediction that most people are ignoring. Not the Iran stuff, not the Trump stuff. The one that affects your everyday life directly. Stay with me. Let's go. First, who is this guy and why should you care what he thinks? His name is Professor Jiang. He's an economist and geopolitical analyst who works out of Singapore. And what makes him different from every other analyst I've watched is that he doesn't just explain things. He makes specific, testable predictions. And then he gets them right. In 2024, he called Trump winning in November. He called the US starting a war against Iran. And he called the US losing that war, and said that losing it would change how power is organized across the entire world. At the time, a lot of people thought that was crazy. The US losing a war with Iran? Iran? The country that couldn't even stop Israel from running airstrikes for months? That prediction sounded insane. And then it started coming true, which means his framework for reading the world actually works. So when the same framework is now producing a new set of predictions, you probably want to pay attention. Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that nobody in mainstream media is explaining clearly. Professor Jiang says the US didn't attack Iran because of terrorism, or nuclear weapons, or any of the stuff you hear about in the news. It attacked Iran because it had no choice if it wanted to keep its empire. Here's how he explains it. The entire American empire runs on one thing, the US dollar being the world's reserve currency. Every time a country buys oil, from the Middle East, from anywhere, they do it in dollars. That creates permanent structural global demand for the dollar. That system worked perfectly for decades. And then in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The US response was to sanction Russia and freeze over $200 billion in Russian assets. And here's the problem. The whole reason countries trusted the dollar as a neutral reserve currency was because America promised it would stay politically neutral. You hold dollars, you're safe. Doesn't matter what side of any conflict you're on. The moment America froze Russian assets, every country that wasn't an American ally looked at their dollar reserves and thought, wait, if America can do that to Russia, they can do that to us. And quietly, they started moving. Russia, China, and Iran started building trade networks that cut out the dollar entirely. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, started talking about gold-backed alternatives. And once you understand that, the Iran attack makes complete sense. China gets 50 to 60% of its energy from the Middle East. If America controls the Middle East, China is permanently dependent on American goodwill for its basic energy supply. That's a chokehold. That's leverage. The attack on Iran wasn't about Iran. It was about preventing the dollar from dying. So here's where Trump's strategy fell apart. And this is the part that got me. Trump looked at what happened in Venezuela. In January of 2026, Delta Force went into Venezuela, grabbed Maduro, and the whole government collapsed, just like that. So Trump figured, Iran is the same. Bomb the leadership. They fold. We win. But here's what he didn't understand about Iran. Iran saw this coming for years, so they restructured their entire military to survive exactly this kind of decapitation strategy. Instead of one centralized chain of command, they built 31 separate armies spread across the country. Each one has its own leadership, its own supply lines, its own orders. You can kill the supreme leader tomorrow and the war doesn't stop. It just keeps going from 31 different directions. Professor Jiang calls this the MOSAK strategy. And the point of the strategy isn't to win quickly. The point is to never lose. You drag it out, you bleed your enemy, you make the cost of the war politically unsustainable at home, and you wait for America to quit. And it's working. Because the other thing Trump got wrong is the American public. America doesn't have the political will to fight a long, expensive ground war in Iran. It doesn't have the manufacturing capacity. It doesn't have the risk tolerance. The military is already talking to Ford and General Motors about converting car factories to munitions production. They just passed a law automatically registering every male between 18 and 24 for the draft. This is not the posture of a country that's winning. Now here's what I found most interesting. The actual strategy the US government published for how it plans to maintain global dominance. It's called the National Defense Strategy, and it's a 4-point plan. Point 1. Secure the Western Hemisphere, meaning North America, South America, the Caribbean, all of it. That's why Trump took over Venezuela. It has the world's largest oil reserves. That's why he's threatening Canada, Greenland, Mexico. If America controls the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire world has to come to America for energy and resources. That's not imperialism, that's leverage. Point 2. Make NATO and East Asian allies pay for their own defense. Europe needs to go fight Russia without American boots on the ground. Japan and South Korea need to contain China. America provides weapons and financing, but the actual fighting shifts to the allies. Point 3. Strangle China economically. The plan is to control something called the Strait of Malacca, the narrow waterway that connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. If you park American naval carriers there, you've just cut off 90% of China's trade routes. China is surrounded by an island chain, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, that blocks it from the Pacific. The Malacca Strait is its only real exit. Control that, and China has to negotiate on American terms. Point 4. Rebuild the American defense manufacturing base. Because right now, it can't produce weapons fast enough to sustain this war. That's a real problem. Now here's where I want to stop and zoom out for a second, because I think most people are watching the headlines and seeing chaos. Trump doing crazy things, wars breaking out, everything feeling unstable. But Professor Jiang is arguing something very different. He's saying this isn't chaos. This is a strategy. A specific, documented, published strategy. Whether you agree with it or not, you need to understand it. This is where Professor Jiang pulls out a chess set to explain the different powers. One of the clearest analogies I've come across for how this all fits together. The United States is a democracy. It's vibrant, creative, flexible. But its weakness is polarization. The way to defeat America isn't to conquer it. You can never conquer America. The way to defeat it is to push it into a civil war. Force the Democrats and Republicans into armed factions. That's what Russia's information warfare strategy is designed to do. Russia's grand strategy is built on a civilizational narrative. Russians believe the world is split between the spiritual, community, faith, tradition, and the material. Individualism, hedonism, consumerism. America is the antichrist of that worldview. That's not propaganda. That's how Russia's actual strategists describe it. And it gives them a moral obligation, in their own framework, to defend Iran from America. Because you can't claim to be the defender of the spiritual world and let the materialist destroy one of your partners. China, interestingly, is not trying to replace America. Professor Jiang says China just wants to be left alone to trade and grow. China's grand strategy is basically, don't provoke America directly, survive the economic strangulation, and outlast. And he actually predicts a grand bargain between the US and China rather than a direct military conflict. Okay? Now the predictions. He puts the probability of this expanding into World War III at 80 to 90%. He says we're already in it, just in the early stages where the public hasn't named it yet. He predicts Trump will find a way to stay in power for a third term, either by getting his son elected and becoming vice president or by using emergency war powers to delay elections. He predicts an AI civilian surveillance state where everything you do online is being recorded and used to predict and control your behavior, not as speculation, as a documented policy direction from multiple governments simultaneously. He predicts Iran is entering a forever war, not a war with a defined end, but a grinding permanent conflict that reshapes the entire Middle East over years. And he predicts Israel achieves the Greater Israel Project, a territory stretching from the Nile in Egypt to the Euphrates in Iraq, the moment America disengages from the Middle East. Now, here's the prediction I said I'd come back to. The AI surveillance state. That's the one that's not a foreign policy problem or a military problem. That's a you problem. The passive recording of your behavior, your preferences, your movements, your communications. That infrastructure is being built right now by every major government. The Iran war, the dollar war, the great power competition, all of it gives governments political cover to pass surveillance legislation that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Most people are watching the geopolitics and missing the thing that's being built quietly in the background while everyone is distracted. Look, I'm not saying Professor Jiang is right about everything. He's making predictions about systems so complex that nobody can claim certainty. But I am saying his framework is working better than anything I've seen in mainstream media. 3 correct calls in a row is not luck. That's a working model of how the world actually operates. And if this video hit, the best thing you can do is share it with one person who needs to understand what's actually happening right now, not the headlines, what's underneath them. I'll see you in the next one.